I'm Finley Brown, and today I'm speaking to esteemed author, broadcaster, and events host Gerry McDade for a very special interview at SNN Sports. So I wanted to start with the 70s at Celtic, because these are not only your formative years as a person, but actually some of the best days that Celtic have had in a long, long time. We've come off the back of a Champions League win, and now you start off with a European final. But can you tell me about that decade for yourself? What it's like as a fan and also as a person?
Well, I think, that decade for me, I know it's hard looking at me, but I was too young to remember the Lisbon Lions, okay? But coming out the back of the Lisbon Lions phase, and my family were all Celtic supporters, grandfathers and all this sort of stuff. So you kind of get brought up into that. So if you were into football, you were only ever going to like one team, and it was Celtic. And of course it coincided with that era of dominance where they did 9 in a row for the first time. And also just the level of success that you almost took for granted in Europe. You expected Celtic to get to a European Cup semi-final or go, to win a cup or whatever, So there was a lot going on in that period, and I grew up with that. And therefore, I suppose it's a bit like, your first James Bond, your first Doctor Who. The first ones that you see are always the ones that stay in your memory. So to me, my greatest Celtic players will always be people like Kenny Dalglish and Dixie Deans. And Pat Bonner hates this, by the way, but Peter Latchford was a big hero.
Why does he hate that?
He was a goalkeeper. And Packy actually fought it out with him to become the number one, which Packy obviously eventually took over. But I always say to Packy, I like you were a great keeper, but Peter Latchford was my god, So I grew up with that. Those first, half dozen years of the 70s were absolutely brilliant to be a Celtic supporter. Then it changed a wee bit, Rangers come back, won a couple of trebles, Jock, Stein was in declining health and he left, and then it was the start of a new era with Billy McNeil coming in as well. So there was a lot going on, and there was a lot to get excited about, and of course it was an era when you just had to rock up at Celtic Park and pay to get in. You didn't have to buy tickets and all this sort of stuff, so it was a much less complicated time to be a football supporter of any club, but particularly likes of Celtic.
But so Celtic, you mentioned Jock Stein, and there will only ever be one Jock Stein. But you've said before that Jock Stein wasn't your manager. Like, who was your formative manager?
Well, it would have been Jock Stein in a sense, because, as I say, when I started, getting into Celtic, he was still the manager, and we used to do this thing when he came on the television and he was talking, we would all get down on our knees and start doing all this sort of stuff, because he was a god. We all thought he was a god. Billy McNeil to me was always the heir apparent. He was always going to come in, and no surprise there to me that he became the Celtic manager as well. But yeah, Stein was my man at that point, and then I grew into Billy McNeil. Was delighted for Billy McNeil for the first year they won the league with 10 men, famously. And everything just seemed to be pointing in that direction, because Billy McNeil always did say there's something special about Celtic, there's something unique about it. And that transition from Jock Stein into Billy McNeil seemed the most normal thing in the world, and therefore the transfer of success seemed, when you look back, you're young, you just think it's always going to be like that. And of course I know we'll get on to other decades where it just wasn't like that,
But then this decade, the 80s, what is that like, that realisation that you might never have it so good again? You're still a successful team.
Yeah, you don't think that at the time. You obviously think it's going to continue. And then I'm getting a wee bit older at that point. I'm in my late teens as we get into the 1980s. And interestingly enough, the challenge wasn't coming from Rangers anymore. It was coming from Aberdeen and Dundee United. Brilliant teams, went far in Europe. Obviously, Fergie winning the Cup Winners' Cup, and Jim McLean to Dundee United to a European Cup final in 1984. So that's where the challenge was coming from. But Celtic were still successful on the home front. They won back-to-back titles, and they were doing really, really well. And you felt they could build on this. And then the shock, obviously, of Charlie Nicholas leaving, and then the back of that, Billy McNeil left, and suddenly you're into that situation. For the first time, really, in my life, I didn't have the obvious contender for the Celtic job, even though I admired Davy Hay greatly. When he came into the job, I thought it was an interesting choice, because we all felt he was quite young at the time as well. So there was that transition of power over to Davy Hay, and then things were a wee bit more difficult for Celtic throughout that period,
Do you think Celtic, how they were doing at the time, did that have an impact on your personal development? It seems like a kind of weird analysis, but maybe that shaped you in a way. Mm-hmm. Because if you're a world-beating team and every week you can go out with your head held high, maybe that changes who you are and like your development as a teenager going into adulthood. Do you feel that's true? Or is that maybe am I stretching a little bit?
There'll be a lot of people that told you I never made it into adulthood anyway, you know, but that's another side of the story. But yeah, I think it coincided with the fact that, you know, my life was changing. I was getting into other things. I was more into music. I was doing other things that were taking me slightly away from the football on a Saturday, whereas before you would go to games or you would always be trying to find out the result. Suddenly you're in a cycle in your life where you remember at 5 o'clock, wait a minute, it's full time. I used to go down to, I come from Greenock, and there used to be like a radio rental shop, and about 4:45 on a Saturday you'd have all these guys, it was always predominantly guys, gathered around just watching the results come in, and that's how you found out how Celtic had got on that particular day. So you went through that period where you automatically, you do kind of fall away from it a wee bit. You still have the passion, you know, but there's a period in your development, as you say, where other things become just a wee bit more important. I had to get a job. Once I got a job, I realised that the industry that I went into was hairdressing. Hairdressers work on a Saturday, that's it, end of. You know.
Football.
No football. You know, so now you're getting your football through the radio. You would have to nip in at 4:30, 4:45 and try and switch it over to Clyde or
Is that what you're doing, sneaking away from a little bit of work just to find out what's going on?
100%.
Really?
Oh yeah, you know, there's no mobile phones, you can't check all this stuff, you can't have scores come in, and you would literally have to go and turn on Clyde's Super Scoreboard and then you would take the tone from who the reporter was or what he was telling you, and you thought, I wonder if they won, I wonder if they get beat, you know. And that brought a certain excitement as well, you know, but I had kind of reconciled at that point, well, this is my career, this is what I want to do, you know, maybe I can go to a European game or I'll wait till there's a cup game in the middle of the week or something like that, and you would go along to that. So inevitably I think you do kind of fall away from it, and then, you know, Celtic had a couple of years where they didn't win the league, and then Davy Hay, as I said, arrived, won the 1985 Scottish Cup. That was a big day, but I was working. So, you know, I would have to listen in to find out what was happening, you know, and it was just how it was. You never thought it was going to be any different. I mean, woe betide you could turn around and say, I know what we'll do. Let's get a television set in the salon, and at 4:45 we turn it around to get the results. That was never going to happen. You know, it wasn't that kind of an industry. So you kept your interest. I know I've said the 70s is really, really important to me, because that's my formative years and that's when I grew up with it. But my Lisbon Lions were the centenary double team in 87, 88, yeah.
Is that your defining memory of like that decade?
Of that decade, yeah, it would be. I mean, there are great memories, you know, back-to-back titles, as I say, Charlie Nicholas coming in, Tommy Burns scoring at Tannadice to win the league title. All that stuff was great in the early 80s. But by the time we get to the late 80s, things had changed a bit. And the big revolution, of course, in Scottish football was Graeme Souness coming in. Yeah. And suddenly, you know, checkbook management was now the way ahead, and Rangers laid down the gauntlet, convincingly won the title, and then, you know, Billy McNeil returns again. You know, it wasn't like 10 years before when he came to the club and I was young and I thought, well, this will be great, you know, this will work out. You're a wee bit older, you're allegedly a bit more mature.
You've seen stuff happen,
yeah,
like you've had the experience.
Thinking, how is this going to work out? And that was a magical season. I mean, it really was. Yeah, because I don't care what anyone says, nobody expected Celtic to win the league that year, maybe a cup, possibly a cup. Because see, Billy McNeil literally built a team from what had happened before. You had to do it very, very quickly. And he brought in unlikely guys like, you know, Billy Stark, who was phenomenal, Chris Morris. Who'd heard of Chris Morris? And he was taking over from Danny McGrain. You had the stalwarts like Roy Aitken and Tommy Burns. You brought in Joe Miller. But to me, the pivotal signing that year was Frank McAvenny. I think once Frank McAvenny arrived from West Ham United, I mean, we signed a guy from the First Division in England, and you think, well, this is special. This could be the defining factor, and I think it was. And Celtic, all this stuff I keep hearing now over the last few years about we never stop and we keep going to the last minute. Well, I'll go back to 87, 88, because that's exactly what was happening. Really? Yeah, Billy Connolly used to crack a joke where Celtic were 1-0 down, they would look at their watches and go, listen, it's fine, there's still 2 minutes to play, we'll win 2-1. And that's the way it felt. And that for me, that was the real, that was my team. Yeah. And I also think, I've said this a few times to people like Roy Aitken and Packy Bonner and guys like that, that was a team like the Lions in that they still have memories of that, they still socialise together, they're still a very, I don't know what word, they're comrades in arms, if you like, you know?
Essentially they are, though. But at that time, there's less separation. This is something I'm curious about between players and fans. People are more likely to live in the area near where they play. Did you have that growing up, and as you're kind of becoming an adult, 70s, 80s, mixing with players? Is that something that happened?
You didn't mix with them so much. I mean, it's like you didn't get to hang out with the Beatles. No. You know what I mean? You knew they were in town, sort of thing. You know. So no, it was still a thrill if you saw a player. Yeah. You know, if you were out in the town on a Saturday night and you saw somebody, I won't name names, of course, but if you saw a player and you would think, you know, it's him. I remember cutting Paul McStay's hair. He was going to, I think it was, Paul married a girl from Greenock, and his sister worked with me actually. Her sister worked with me, and she was getting married, and Paul rocked into the salon. Classic Paul McStay. The wedding's at 3 o'clock, but I think I'll come in and get a haircut about 12:30. And I did something that I'd never done. I trumped everybody. I said, no, I'm cutting his hair. You know, nobody else knew who he was, you know. And you thought, God, you're cutting Paul McStay's hair.
Surely your hands must have been like...
Well,
did you go full surgeon and just...
Well, you're trying to... Obviously, you're trying to be professional, because I'm completely professional, but at the same time, there's a million questions I want to ask him. But he was exactly the Paul McStay I thought he would be, quite quiet, you know, didn't really want to talk about it all, you know. And I thought, right, fair enough, we respect that, and we come back from it. But yeah, I think it was a time, and maybe, you know, as I say, you would occasionally see players out. Certainly, it was an era that if you were up around Celtic Park on a training day, you would see the players coming back from Barrowfield, and that was maybe how you got your advantage, if you like. That obviously changed when, you know, like Celtic moved out to Lennoxtown or Rangers moved to Murray Park. Now you don't have the players coming back to the ground on such a regular basis.
And so we go into the 90s, and this is the era.
Do we have to in the 90s?
Yeah. Well, this is the one that everyone wants to pretend never happened. But what is it like? You've spent your whole life essentially being top dog, and then there's what might be the worst decade of your life. How was that like on the East End, like the east side of Glasgow, to live that?
It was hard, but because you love your football and because you've got a team, every season would start with hope. Yeah. Every season, you know, when Billy left and then Liam Brady came in, I thought, well, this is different, you know, and it's Liam Brady. You know, Republic of Ireland, you know, played in Italy, played all over, played for Arsenal, West Ham, and I thought he'd be a perfect fit, but you never know. Of course. And sadly, it didn't really work out for Liam for many reasons. But I think obviously the big story around that time, and it's been well chronicled by far better writers than I, was about the ownership of the club and what direction it was going financially. I mean, Rudy Vata obviously talked about that in the book that we did, where it was a difficult time to be around the club, and there was a lot of pressure on them, you know. And then you have that unimaginable thing, because I think up till about the mid-1960s and Jock Stein's arrival, Celtic's successes had been celebrated but almost sporadic in many ways, you know. So by the time you get into the 90s, the thought that Celtic would go from 1989 to 1995 without a trophy, I mean, that I had been brought up to think that was absolutely unthinkable, but it happened. Especially
when you feel like there's nothing you can do, and each year passes, and like you think it's just balance is going to be restored. I wanted to ask as well, Graeme Souness.
Yes.
Opposite side, but what was it like to have him come into Scottish football? Because it feels like he had like a seismic impact.
Oh yeah.
What was that like at the time? When he arrived, did you expect anything like the kind of impact he did have?
Difficult to say. I mean, the first thing was, it was Graeme Souness. Yeah. He was a huge name, you know. The second thing was, fortuitously for Rangers at that point as well, no English teams were allowed to play in Europe after Heysel in 1985. That was a real turning point, you know, a real determinant that this was the way Rangers were going to go. So now they could entice people like Chris Woods and Terry Butcher and Gary Stevenson, all these guys up to Scotland, because they would say to them, well, you're going to play in the European Cup, or you're going to play, you know, certainly going to play in Europe at some point, as well as win trophies. And that was a big determining factor. My understanding was that Billy McNeil wanted to reply to that, but he wanted to go for Peter Beardsley and Chris Waddle after the centenary year for the same reasons, that they could entice them up by the European thing. So that was the big advantage at that point. And Graeme Souness was Graeme Souness. He wasn't going to be bossed about. He was going to be his own man and do what he wanted. And yeah, I think it'd be fair to say he pretty much revolutionised Scottish football, and the impact is still felt to this day. Suddenly Celtic were going out and paying £1 million for John Collins. So the Celtic had kind of gone from being a club that nurtured a lot of their talent to suddenly realising we need to start buying players and we need to start spending big money. And that's what they started doing. That was a knock-on of the Souness effect as well.
Is that strange as a fan to kind of, you're seeing in real time football change completely? Bozeman's happening, like big money signings, fewer and fewer homegrown. Does that at any point maybe alter you still love your club immensely, but does your relationship with it change in a way?
Well, I think your relationship changes as you get older anyway, in a certain respect. You know, you always maintain your hope and your faith and your trust in a club, but yeah, you're aware of the changes and you're looking at it, and you know, suddenly you're hearing players being bought that you've never heard of. You know, I mean, you could know for a certain degree what Frank McAvenny was going to bring because you knew his reputation. I'd never heard of Pierre Van Hooijdonk. I'd never heard of Jorge Cadete or Paulo Di Canio. Yeah. So I didn't know what we were getting, and I suppose most Celtic supporters were like that as well.
No YouTube highlights.
Not in those days. No, that would be coming later down the line. You know, I mean, you know what happens now. If Celtic or Rangers are linked with any player now,
full video,
full
broadcast.
Videos, the floor. This boy looks
Everyone's
good.
An expert.
And that, of course, that's another big change in it. But yeah, it's the 90s were difficult. I mean, there were hard times, and even when Celtic did win a trophy by beating Airdrie in the Scottish Cup final, you know, I remember again I was working that day, and we had to kind of tune in, and it was pretty nerve-wracking because you were so desperate, particularly because they'd lost on penalties to Raith Rovers. Prior to that in the League Cup final, I mean, that was one of the most, I'd say it's maybe one of the most desperate days.
Really?
Oh yeah.
Have you talk me through that day for yourself?
No, listen, I had to get therapy after it. I don't want to go back into that. It was, again, you go into it, Raith were firing high at the top of the division, the lower division, and Celtic were Celtic, you know, they just about scraped into the final actually. I was at the semi against Aberdeen, which went pretty much all the way. But you were confident. I mean, you thought, you know, it's Raith Rovers, you know, with all due respect, you expect Celtic to do the job here. And then the game plays out, and I just think you could see the tension in people like Charlie Nicholas and Gordon Marshall was in goal that day, and Tom Boyd, and all these guys, you could feel the tension for them. And even when Charlie Nicholas scored to put Celtic 2-1 ahead with not a lot of time to go, you still felt, can we see this out? And of course we didn't. And I have to say there was a feeling when it went to penalties, then you're like, this is a lottery now, it could go either way. And I really, really felt for Paul McStay that day, because obviously he missed the penalty. And there is a picture of Paul coming off the park, I think with John Collins, and he just looks absolutely inconsolable. You know, as if this is, so, and you buy into that pain as well. But yeah, the fact is, you know, you had a chance to win a trophy, and you didn't. Now, if you'd said to me 20 years before, you know, you're going to bank everything on a League Cup victory, you'd have laughed at that, because Celtic were winning everything. You never become used to the fact that you're not winning. You still think. I mean, I had a friend that put money on Celtic every year to win whatever European trophy they were at, even in the 90s, yeah. And so you always had that hope. Certainly when they won the Scottish Cup, when Tommy Burns was manager, you thought this is the beginning of something. You know, McCann had come in. You knew it was a project that would take a while, but you were buying into that process, you know. But there were tough times then, you know, because there are certain people that will tell you, and I'm talking even in the last 10 years, the most entertaining Celtic side that they saw was the one that Tommy Burns put together in 95, 96, when you had Cadete, Tom, Van Hooijdonk, Di Canio and all these guys. Jackie McNamara, of course, was in that side as well. And the football they played was pretty special. But at the end of the day, they had nothing to show for it. And that became the defining thing, as did obviously Rangers going on to do 9 in a row. So
that 10th season.
Yes.
What is that like for you? That must be hell on earth. With each passing week, surely you're thinking like, ahead of it, this could be the worst year of my life. Like 10 in a row.
Sporting life,
of course, yeah.
Okay, so the thing about it is the parallels are exact for the 10 years before in a sense, right? You've got a new guy coming in, okay, Billy McNeil wasn't a new guy, but he has to absolutely rebuild a team from scratch in a sense, right? He's got to bring in his own players. And Rangers were well established. I mean, I don't care what anyone says, there wouldn't have been a bookie that would have taken money on Celtic to win the title that year, you know, and even right down to the wire as it did go. There were moments in the season where you started to think, I think particularly when they won the League Cup against Dundee United, I always felt that was a statement of intent. They could win something, they could go on and do something. And then there was this wonderful talent called Henrik Larsson, who was, you know, even at that stage people were comparing him to Douglas, and that was a new thing, you know. But the tension was unbearable, you know, and certainly anyone ever spoken to, Jackie McNamara talks about it in the book. You know, yes, you enjoy winning the league, but relief. When the final whistle went that day against St Johnstone, it was relief. I would hate to see the haircuts I did that day, to be honest, because I had to work. Yeah. And, you know, the week before they'd gone to Dunfermline, and if they won, they were winning it. And Simon Donnelly always tells me it kind of annoyed him that they didn't win it because they'd have won it with his goal, you know. And then the build-up that week to the St Johnstone game, you know. And then I remember reading an interview with Jonathan Gould, the goalkeeper, and he was a real gung-ho character. Goalkeepers are crazy anyway, let's be honest, you know. And he was basically like, well, let's just go win it on Saturday. And he just said it, and we thought, yeah, you could do that, you know. But it was a hard day, it really was. And right up to the, you know, I was massively tuning into it that day. You know, I was going up and down the stairs all the time, scored the early goal, and you think, well, that's brilliant. And then you think, oh, is that a good thing? You know, and the longer the game went on. And I was actually upstairs, had the radio on when Harold Brack scored. And the only reason I knew he'd scored was because I thought that the radio was going to explode because the level of noise, this eruption, this roar, and it was a lot of relief as well. It clearly was, you know, they've done it, you know, and it's, you know, yeah, it stopped to 10. I get all that. That seemed to be an important thing, but more importantly, Celtic were suddenly league champions again, you know, and you felt, is this a platform that they can build from? To be honest, that day, I didn't care if it was a platform. They'd done it. Yeah. They'd won it. Suddenly you had new heroes. But yeah, the overwhelming feeling that day, and I can't speak for everybody, with me, total relief.
I think it would have been shared.
Oh, the tension was just...
But it does build a platform because the 2000s, it's return to Europe. It's not just kind of league success. Of course, Celtic and Rangers still fighting it out more even than ever, but you're back in Europe and you're back. Does that feel like a return almost to the best days? Is that 2003 run?
That must have been incredible for you.
Yeah, I think again, the build-up, you know, they'd won the title in 98 and we thought, this is great, we can build on it. And then Janssen left. And then Dr. Joe came in and he had his own style of doing things. And then we thought we got, you know, this, we all thought we were getting Kenny Dalglish and John Barnes. It turned out we were getting John Barnes and Kenny Dalglish, and it became another false dawn that year, you know. And then what happened was, you don't want to preempt this, but I remember listening to the first game of the season when Martin O'Neill was manager. Celtic were playing on the Sunday away to Dundee United, and Willie Miller of all people was on Radio Scotland, and they were asking him about this. And I remember Willie Miller clearly saying, "This sounds like the real deal. Martin O'Neill sounds like the real deal for Celtic. After these false dawns that they'd had, he sounds like the real deal." And you think, and he was so impressive when he came in. You know, again, who would have thought he would have done the treble in his first season? You know, because again, he was starting from a position. Okay, he's brought in Chris Sutton, and he's got you know, Henrik Larsson to work with. So you've got the quality there, and his Leicester team were always built on, you know, powerful and you don't beat us and then we try and score. And I always felt that if he'd arrived and Larsson had wanted to leave, he would have left and signed Emil Heskey, because Emil Heskey was more of a Martin O'Neill forward than Henrik Larsson was, and Henrik Larsson won him over because he was Henrik Larsson, you know. So yeah, that the treble was glorious that year, it really was. But I think just as important, you felt this is the start of something now. You know, we've got a guy here who's committed to the job. He's an elite manager, and he gets it. He gets the club, you know. and this is somebody that can take. Did I think we were going to go to a European final? No, of course not.
But you did, and it's an incredible kind of run, and then obviously to lose it in the most heartbreaking fashion. Is that any solace that you put up a fight, or is it just, it's difficult to just...
I remember the night before it, my friend called me, we were talking on the phone, we were both going to go watch it at home, with a few libations, of course. And I remember saying to him, I said, look, John, I said, I never thought I'd see in my lifetime Celtic in a European final, really see it. I'm just going to sit back and enjoy it. And he said, yeah, I want you to name me the team that lost in 1970 to Feyenoord. And I started going through it, I could get a few, and he said, that's my point. You got to win it. You have to win it, you know? And I said, right, okay. So yeah, it was difficult to take. You have all those emotions that you're proud of the team to get there. But ultimately, you don't take the trophy, you know, and that's kind of where I professionally started to come into the Celtic orbit.
Well, tell me about that, how that came about.
Well, that had come about because for about 2 years I'd been writing sketch material for Off the Ball for Radio Scotland, and I'd met quite a few people at that particular point. And one of the guys I met worked for a production company, and he phoned me 2 days before this final in Seville and said, look, Celtic are looking to make a video, it wasn't even a DVD, make a video of the Seville run. And I said, right, okay. I said, what they need is someone who, you know, knows the club, understands the history, and can write a script. And I said, well, yeah, definitely. So of course, typically my luck, they go out and lose. Then they go and lose the league on the Sunday to Rangers, and you think, well, that's that done. But then what happened was I got a call the following day from the guy and said, no, they still want to do it because it's historic. So would you do it? And I said, yeah, I did. So I went and did this, wrote the script for this video. And it was good. It's a hard watch because ultimately, you know, it's like, you know, watching the Buddy Holly story, you know the plane's going to go down at the end sort of thing, you know. But we did it and I enjoyed it. Yeah. And I thought, well, maybe there's more of this sort of thing, because we're getting into that era where all that sort of stuff was becoming very much the rage. So what I did was I got in touch with the guy afterwards and I said, look, I really enjoyed that. Let me know if there's anything else going. And he said to me, well, actually, what is going to happen here is Celtic are going to take it in-house. So, you know, you'd be better to get in touch with them. So he gave me a contact who turned out a great guy called Tony Hamilton, who's now the chief exec of Celtic FC Foundation. And Tony was head of media at that point. And I got an email and sent it off. I later learned that this was typical Tony. You know, generally what happens is when you send emails to people at publishers, it's about a week and a half before they get back. Tony got back to me within about 20 minutes and said, why don't you come up and have a chat? So I went up and we had a good blather about things. And he said, look, I could use somebody. You know, we're going to do more of these sort of videos. And he asked me to do, they were doing a video of Chris Sutton. And then they wanted to do one of John Hartson. So Sutton Impact and then Celtic Dragon. So I did those, thoroughly enjoyed them.
Celtic have one of my kind of biggest memories of Scottish football, and that's the night they beat Barcelona.
Yes, which I was fortunate enough to work at.
You were in the stadium?
Yeah, I was working at Celtic at that point.
Can you tell me about that? Because that's something that most people never get to experience. That is one of the greatest nights in Scottish football.
Yeah, there's an interesting backstory to that because Celtic were celebrating their anniversary, 125 years. And on the Tuesday night, they had a special mass at St Mary's in the Carlton. And everybody was at it, club officials, etc., etc. And that almost felt like the preparation for the Barcelona game. You know, it sounds a bit wishy-washy to say, but you felt there was something special in the air. You know, something was happening here, you know. And, you know, having worked with Neil Lennon, interviewed him weekly for Celtic TV, because that's what I was doing at that point, and seeing the strength of character that he had, and knowing that you had players like Victor Wanyama in the team and that they could do a job, you know. It was the atmosphere that night. I mean, I don't think I've ever experienced anything like it in my sporting life, you know, in that you just felt there was something going to happen. You really did. And actually when Celtic took the lead through Victor Wanyama, it wasn't a surprise. It didn't feel like a surprise. No, it didn't feel like a surprise. You have to drink these moments in, right? So my job at that point, I'd have been out at the tunnel working that night. At that point, I think one of my jobs was to look down the tunnel, stand out in the pitch, look down the tunnel, and see the captain, Scott Brown, or whoever's bringing the team out. And as soon as I saw him coming down the tunnel, I would motion to the guy up in the box to start playing the music. Right, that's how it worked. And you know, you're doing a job, you're directing the traffic in a sense. But on the other hand, you know, you have to sit back and say, wait a minute, look around you, take this in. I remember going to see Celtic play Liverpool that year, 97-98. Again, a statement of intent that year because Liverpool ultimately won the tie. But it was a great game. But the atmosphere that night between the Celtic and the Liverpool supporters was hairs in the back of your neck stuff. It really was. And it felt like that the night of the Barcelona game as well. But, I mean, when Tony Watt went through to score, I mean, you'd thought, well, we're seeing something special here. This is really special, you know. And you felt even at that time, it doesn't matter what Tony Watt ever goes on to do in his life again. This is I mean, you know, he could be scuba diving in Bermuda in 25 years' time, and somebody's going to say to him, I was there the night you scored that goal against Barcelona. It'll stay with you for all of your days, you know. And it was a colossal night. And I felt it was a colossal night for Neil as well. I was delighted for him because he put so much work into it. And then to see him, I think we actually filmed, they did the draw for the next sort of stages, and we filmed the boys as the teams were coming out and all this sort of stuff. And I remember watching Neil, I think he went to like all the managers of the teams that were in the knockout stages, and there he sat, and I felt really, really proud for him because I knew how hard he'd worked for it. And some of the criticism he'd taken, you know, coming back in and becoming manager, which, hey, took some, you talk about character, Neil Lennon's got character. I think it showed that night, you know, that he put a team out onto the park that could do a job against arguably the greatest side.
It was, at that time. And so, jumping ahead, there are the years without Europe. Mm-hmm. But what I want to talk about is the kind of Brendan Rodgers years.
Yeah.
Does that kind of breathe new life into the club? Does it feel like there's something different happening? Like you've just accelerated into something? Difficult to...
Yeah, it's difficult, I suppose, to analyse it too much. You know,
I'm still in it in a way.
Yeah, well, Ange Postecoglou came in as, you know, I mean, I think...
Ange who kind of...
Ange who, and Alan Brazil famously got caught out on TalkSport. He was, you know, having a big joke about it and obviously came to eat his words. You know, I mean, I know Alan's not averse to eating a few things now and again, but he came to eat his words that night because Ange Postecoglou, within about 2 or 3 weeks, I mean, the first time I saw him being interviewed, I thought, oh, this is different. Does it? Yeah, absolutely. You know, I remember Celtic get put out of Europe, and this reporter said to him, it's a catastrophe. And he sort of looked at him, and we all came to realise that, see, if Ange Postecoglou looked at you in the face and used the word mate, you were in trouble. Right? And he said, well, you know, I'd like to know your definition of a catastrophe, mate, because it's not mine, and things like that. And he thought, well, this is a real breath of fresh air for by the football, you know. So we thought, well, this guy's going to be different. And then he brought in these players, and you know, suddenly Celtic were playing with an intensity and a pace, and you know, it was absolutely brilliant to watch. And in some ways, it was like back, you know, we talked about that Tommy Burnside and how the free-flowing football and the essence of that, and that was the Ange Postecoglou game. You know, he was just the classic breath of fresh air. Great to come in at the time. Of course, he comes in on the back of a bad season for Celtic for very many reasons that didn't work out that season for them. And he comes in, and everybody had been talking about Eddie Howe. So, but that, you know, Ange Postecoglou comes in. He's his own man. One of the most interesting, some might say admirable things about him was that he worked with the backroom staff he was given. You know, he didn't have to bring in his own men. Now, I mean, this is a guy that's come halfway around the world. You know, again, there was a question. Celtic were playing Hearts the first game, which they lost away at Tynecastle, and he was asked by a reporter, you know, how much do you know about Hearts? Have you heard of Hearts? And he looked at him. I think he said, "Mate," again. He said, "Well, you know, I've not been on the moon, you know. I mean, I know my football, you know." So he was an unapologetic type of guy. This is what I do, and this is how I'm going to do it. And within a very, very short period of time, you know. Now I know they went through a period that season where you thought, are they going to do it? But there were triggers coming on. Again, I get back to that 87-88 season. Celtic kept going to the end, they never stopped. There was one game, particularly they played Dundee United at Celtic Park, and they were due to play Rangers on the Wednesday, and there was nothing each, and they needed to get the points to get within range of Rangers to overtake them at the top of the table. And I was going to Glasgow that day, and the trains were off because there was a storm, and I had to get the bus up. I was going to meet some friends, and I was listening to it on the radio, and it was nothing each. And I got off the bus and I started walking down towards Central Station, and I thought, well, that's that. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen here, And I heard this guy just bellow, yes, right? I thought, right, you either support Celtic or you support Rangers, one of the two. And of course then I found out that Lila Bada had scored in the 145th minute or whatever it was, to secure the 3 points, and that kind of summed up that season to me. Then they went on to beat Rangers the Wednesday night, which didn't surprise me in the least because I felt they had the momentum. So you felt as if you were watching something very, very special happen before your eyes, and it in some ways the quality of the football did roll back the years for me to some of the brilliant Celtic sides that I'd seen over the years.
Getting back to what football can mean to people, do you feel like you've done that now working with Greenock Morton? Is it a completely different kind of relationship with football that you have now?
My background with Morton has always been that I had one grandfather that was a Morton diehard, and he used to take me to the games, and they were local, and it was easy to get in. And again, a bit like the Celtic thing, it happened to coincide at a time for me when Morton went through a golden period. They had a great team, they were part-time. They had a guy called Andy Ritchie, who I'm very proud to say has become like a brother to me in the last few years, because Andy and I have worked together extensively. So I was kind of brought up on that as well. I would go and see them and go and support them through that. And then this opportunity to come up a few years ago to go and do their hospitality first of all, then to work with the team. And yeah, when you get to work with the team and you see the boys and you get to know, of course you want them to win. And the dynamic is that you get excited for them, as well. They've got a fantastic manager in Dougie Imrie now. I think he's one of the best managers. In fact, he is one of the best managers in the division. Given the budget that he works on, and you see how he motivates his players and how he gets the absolute best out of them. So yeah, it gives me enormous pleasure to be hosting the hospitality for them, to see the hope from the supporters, and just to get back to the good old-fashioned idea of you go along to a game and you get entertained, and that's very much a part of it. So Morton has given me that as well.